This episode contains non-graphic mention of suicide and has real audio recordings of the neighbor's experience in the aftermath. Listener discretion is advised. Today's story involves Michelle, who has joined up with some of my own podcasts, and as an artist with ongoing projects, she became obsessed with exploring the story of one of her friends in a house that saw tragedy and strange occurrences that were experienced firsthand. My name is Edwin, and here is Michelle's true scary story.
I'd been going to Tokoloma Road for about 5 years, and it was like such an awesome place to visit. I'd stay with my friend Diane, who was a family friend, the mother of one of my kindergarten friends. So I became better friends with Diane than my kindergarten friend, actually. Every summer during college, I would go and I'd visit Diane on Tokoloma Road. And it was such a fun neighborhood because it was in the middle of the desert. So everybody was inside during the scorching hot summer. And so at night, everyone was outside on the street, like one of their neighbors, they called him Cheese Fang. I don't really know why, but Cheese Fang would blast Alice Cooper radio while he worked on his cars, and then Diane and I would drink tequila under the stars, like in her front yard, just listening to the neighborhood. It was so fun and magical and weird. It was just like a neighborhood full of like old hippies and like cactus, and it was just great. 2008 happened, and that was the housing crash. A few people in the neighborhood lost their houses, like Cheese Fang lost his house and had to move. And then another neighbor of theirs named Susan killed herself. And Susan had lived kitty corner from Diane. Susan was this tall blonde. I always liked her, but she always seemed like she had something going on.
As Michelle was working on her art project, she asked for a description of Susan from Diane.
You want me to talk about Susan, who was my neighbor? She was tall and blonde and very pretty. And outwardly, she was pretty outgoing, but you could tell that there was like a dark side to her. I always noticed. Mm-hmm. She was just kind of standoffish at times. And so I just let her be. You hear that big rumble of that fire truck, and of course, you go running to the front windows to see what's going on at 6 a.m. and they stop. And so I noticed that Nancy, who lived across the street and was very good friends with Susan, that she had come running out in her pajamas and was just standing there. And so I went out and stood next to her, and we were just watching the scene unfold. And all of a sudden, here comes the sheriff walking out with this like gun on a, I don't know, what are they, pen or a pencil or something, and he put it into the car. We're just standing there going, oh my God, what happened? She's still around in her spirit shape, whatever it might be.
Obviously, that was like a herald of change in the neighborhood. The vibe just started to change. The people started to change in the neighborhood. It started to get really dodgy. Diane wouldn't hang out in her front yard anymore because there was like a guy who would walk up and down the street that just freaked her out. And she just would, because she was like living alone. And then another person moved into Susan's old house because her husband left and it was empty. And this guy named James moved into Susan's old house. And James killed himself. Nancy is Diane's direct neighbor. So if you had to look at it, Diane's house, Nancy, Susan, across the street. So Nancy and Diane are friends. Diane and Susan weren't friends, but not friends. But Nancy and Susan were really good friends. And she'd known James a little bit. James had said that he would wake up and there would be a woman pulling at his feet at night. He had to move his bedroom. And one time Nancy was like, saw him gardening, and he was like, oh, I have to leave these for the spirits in the house. They said, he's another weirdo that's just moved into the neighborhood. This is okay, whatever. But yeah, he'd had an accidental overdose 2 weeks before, and then he had a full overdose when he killed himself. And they just thought it was suicide. They just went with suicide on it. Another family moved into that house, and they'd hear screaming. They'd hear somebody saying hello in the garage. They'd have things being banged around in the kitchen. So they called the San Bernardino Paranormal Society. I actually tried to track them down, and I could not find them at the time. I really did. As my investigative mind was like, I need more. I went and I interviewed Nancy for my project. And Diane came with me, and you can hear like Diane's little commentaries on the tape and stuff like that, which is nice. Nancy tells this whole story about how when the paranormal investigators went over there, nothing was happening. And this is the third family that's moved in, right? So it's been Susan, James, new family. New family's having all these problems. They're renting, so no one disclosed to them that there was 2 deaths in the house in like the last 2 years. So they get the paranormal investigators over there, and nothing's happening. And then like the granddaughters, wait, Nancy knew both of those people. Let's go get Nancy. And so Nancy went over there and had a full-fledged conversation with Susan, and was talking with Susan through one of those like detectors or whatever, like the EMF things. And it's funny because Nancy really doesn't divulge what Susan said, but she said that Susan kept saying private. It's private. Like it just keeps getting weirder, right? So my mother got a camera blessed by a Tibetan priest to see ghosts. And so I had this camera, and so anything ghost related, right? I was like, oh, there's potential for me to use this camera. And because I was a photographer for so long, I would use this camera periodically, but I never like took it literally, right? I always thought of ghosts more as like memories. People are haunted by all sorts of things that aren't literal specters. But I'm always fascinated when she was having this literal supernatural paranormal experience. Like it was happening to someone who is not a huge paranormal person, like someone who's just a lady in the desert. And it was happening to everyone in the neighborhood. Everyone was having weird moments of they'd see a figure in that house's window, or like something strange would happen. So I was just so fascinated by that. And so I took Nancy's portrait with the ghost camera and recorded the audio. So that was like the plan. In my old work, I'd record audio or do like a one-liner, and I'd write a one-liner underneath the photograph. So I was like gonna do a bunch of photographs like that. But I did take a photo of Nancy wearing Susan's old coat, and she has it on like this, and it still smells like her, which is, I think, the quote I used. It was an interesting time, and I could tell it was ending, like that magical time. So I think maybe the art project was also to explore that. Susan and Nancy were pretty good friends, and she misses her. She was saying in the recording that she'd love to go over there and privately talk to Susan, as opposed to having the people from the paranormal team there, because clearly Susan didn't want anything personal talked about in front of anybody. Go back to Diane's, and we have our normal night. I mean, we just hang out, and there was no air conditioning in her house, so we just all sweated to death. And so at night she'd leave like the birds outside because it was like cool. She had pet birds. They'd be outside my room, and I was sleeping with all the windows open. Woke up in the middle of the night, and I just heard crying, like sobbing, like the deepest sobbing. If I was in your headphones right now, crying, like full on body shaking sobs. And I thought something had happened to Diane's birds outside, like, because it was that close, and I was like, uh-oh, like an animal in the desert finally killed the birds. It just wouldn't stop, and so I finally got out of bed, and Diane's bedroom was on the other side of the house, and I walk over, and I knock on her door, and the crying stops, and no one's crying. Diana's not awake. No one was crying. The next day I tell Diane what happened, and she's like, oh, that's weird, especially because we were like dealing with Susan's ghost. She goes next door and asks Nancy if because Nancy's house was right near my window, and is like, was anybody crying at your house? And she's like, no. What strikes me now is that Susan came, if it was Susan kept saying private. And then here I am telling her story. And I was like there documenting her story, and she didn't want any of that to happen. Like why I got a little sobbing visit in the middle of the night. I don't know. But that's the story.
Michelle then records a short interview with Nancy, who tells about her own experience with the paranormal investigators and the communication she was able to establish with Susan's ghost on the property. I have part of the actual recording up next.
If you hear Nancy's recording, she talks about all the stuff that James experienced. So you'd have to listen to Nancy's stuff. But she talked about, which I totally forgot, is that when the paranormal investigators came, they got rid of James because they just asked do you know you're dead? And then all of a sudden, all the stuff that people were associating with James went away.
So did they call the paranormal investigators, or had they heard about it?
They looked them up online, because when they first moved in, they were not told that there'd been a suicide there, so they didn't know. Finally, one time she asked me. She says, did something of a bad nature, something happen here? And I says, why would you ask? And she said, because I hear a woman screaming. She has a dog that will not even go into Susan's bathroom. Absolutely won't go. And they say the animals are more susceptible paranormal than anybody else, and children, small children. So then I told her, and she says, well, that makes sense. And then she was just mad. She was just furious because they had lied to her. They had not told her. She was asking, is something going on here? Something happened here? And they said, oh, the one gentleman did die there, but he died of natural causes. No, that was ruled a suicide as well. So so the Paranormal Society, what they did was they went on, they found him online, and the Paranormal Society investigated whether they wanted to look at this. When they found that it was right down from the cemetery, they considered this to be all Indian land, so there's probably a lot of Indian burial, and then 2 suicides. That's what made them interested in coming out to see if anything had happened. Got here at 7, and they set up everything, and then they had everybody outside of the house except for the investigators. They were going around doing audio talking and that kind of thing, but it wasn't until about 10:30 or so when they said, can I go across the street and get Nancy? Because Nancy knew them, both of them. And that's when the machine started going crazy. Okay, we know Nancy, type of thing. So then they started getting results was once I got over there, and there was talking, there was you could see the machines lighting up when, something was going on. It was really interesting. I was over there from about 10, whenever I went over at 10 till midnight, and then standing in the garage or standing out in the driveway talking till about 12:30. So I would like to go over just sometime when they're not there and sit and communicate, because she never touched me. She talked through the voice box that they have type thing directly to me. I started talking and she just said very clearly, private.
Yeah.
Either keep it to yourself, or what she was saying was, this is private, please don't talk about it. Let's talk alone. I would love to have an experience, because I'm open to it. Don't have a problem with that. I don't ever want to get involved with something malevolent. And they say don't ever bring a Ouija board into your home, because that's just opening a door to something. I did a lot of reading, and it was interesting afterwards. My mother asked me, how did you feel? Then it started hitting me. That was really bizarre. The next couple of days, I felt real unsettled, glazed over. Diane saw me.
Yeah, I saw you.
And she said, I just seemed...
Her eyes were just like...
my mind was trying to process everything.
Yeah,
it was a weird feeling. Because I remember seeing her leave that day to go to the hospital when they picked her up. I saw her, that blank look on her face. I knew she was dead leaving the house. I've always thought that there is something there's something more to, and especially if you die a violent death or not of your choosing type of thing, or even of your choosing violent way, that there could be residual left.
I felt like I needed to record these interviews because I was working on an art project and I would pull quotes from audio to use on photographs of different images. It was really important to me to document these stories, and I'm glad I did because Nancy and Diane both opened up in ways. I think they just wanted to tell their story, honestly. I always do stuff with Diane. I've worked with Diane a ton, but I think Nancy was just happy to talk about her friend because I don't think a lot of people appreciate or take that kind of experience seriously. Like talking to a dead person through a recorder might weird somebody out, but I was like, I'm here for it. No, you had a conversation.
If you have your own true scary story that you want to share, please go to truescarystory.com or write to me at the email in the description of this episode to have you on. If you have questions about it, just let us know. Up next, be sure to check out Scary Story Podcast. You can find it by searching on your podcast app right now. Thank you very much for listening. See you soon.